Every crewed Apollo mission flew with something broken, and the flight you remember as the near disaster wasn't the closest call. One crew rode home inside a spacecraft its own engineers weren't sure would survive re-entry. Nobody told them. I went through the anomaly summaries in all 11 crewed mission reports and both accident board investigations. No rescue ship existed. No one was coming. Apollo is remembered as the program that worked. It's closer to the truth to call it the program that kept getting away with it. November 14, 1969. Rain over Cape Kennedy. Inside the capsule sit Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, and Alan Bean. In the stands, President Nixon. And here's the part almost nobody gets right. The weather that morning was within the launch rules. There was no natural lightning near the pad. That's the problem. The rules of 1969 said you don't fly through a thunderstorm. They said nothing about what happens when a rocket the length of a football field drags a column of ionized exhaust through an electrified cloud. Nobody had measured that. Nobody knew it needed measuring. 36.5 seconds after liftoff, the Saturn V triggered its own lightning. It wasn't struck. It created the strike. NASA's official analysis concluded the vehicle itself initiated the discharges. The whole panel lit up. All 3 fuel cells dropped offline. The guidance platform lost its reference. Conrad radioed that everything in the world had just dropped out. At 52 seconds, the second strike. In Houston, the numbers made no sense. And they hadn't fallen to zero. That would at least have been understandable. They were frozen at strange, impossible in-between values. Mission Control was blind during powered ascent, and an abort was on the table. But a year earlier, something small had happened. A controller named John Aaron had stayed on a night shift to watch a command module test. The operators cut the power by accident, and the readings didn't drop to zero. They stuck at odd numbers, 6.7, 12.3. Aaron chased the cause down to an obscure box called the Signal Conditioning Equipment, and learned there was a way to bring it back to life on low voltage. No simulator taught that. The simulator would have shown zeros. So when those same impossible numbers appeared on his console, Aaron was the only man in the building who knew what he was looking at. He was 26 years old. He said 4 words almost nobody understood. Try SCE to aux. The Capcom had to ask what the hell that was before passing it up. Bean flipped the switch. The telemetry came back instantly. They recovered the fuel cells, realigned the platform in Earth orbit, and Houston made the call. They went to the moon. But a doubt stayed behind in that room. One nobody said out loud. Something that couldn't be checked. And it wouldn't be answered for 10 more days. Conrad, Gordon, and Bean flew a Block 2 command module. Their cabin filled with warning lights and did not burn. That cabin existed because of what happened 2 years earlier on Pad 34. January 27, 1967. Command Module 012, a Block 1, sitting on a Saturn IB. At 1 in the afternoon, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee climb in. Grissom, the first man to fly in space twice. White, the first American to walk outside a spacecraft. Chaffee, a rookie. His launch was 3 weeks away. The test was called Plugs Out, the spacecraft running on its own power, disconnected from the ground, and it was not classified as hazardous. That label was reserved for tests with fuel loaded or pyrotechnics armed. The rocket was empty, so on paper this was routine. The review board later concluded the conditions were extremely hazardous and that nobody had recognized them as such, because the danger wasn't in the rocket. It was in the air, pure oxygen at 16.7 pounds per square inch. At sea level we breathe 14.7. In that atmosphere, Velcro becomes fuel and nylon burns while spitting out flaming fragments. The cabin was full of both. By 6:30 in the evening, they had been inside for 5.5 hours. Communications with the blockhouse next door were so bad that Grissom finally snapped. How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings? 1 minute later, a voltage spike on one of the AC buses. At 18:31 and 4 seconds, someone says a single word. The board could never determine what it was, or who said it. 2 seconds later, a voice reports a fire in the cockpit. 15 seconds after the first call, the pressure hull ruptures. At 17, all transmissions end. And here's something that gets told wrong almost every time. They did not burn to death. The medical board determined asphyxiation from toxic gases. Most of the burns came afterward. They lost consciousness in seconds. The pad crews took 5.5 minutes to open the 3 hatches. The inner one opened inward. In flight that made sense. Cabin pressure would seal it shut with no heavy mechanism. On the ground, with the fire's own pressure pushing from inside, it was physically impossible to open. The worse the fire got, the more impossible it became. It's often said the design came from Grissom's Mercury hatch accident. Nothing in the board's report supports that. The worst part is that it was already known. Module 012 had been delivered with 113 engineering orders incomplete. The program stopped for 20 months. A new hatch, opening outward, in under 10 seconds. A mixed atmosphere on the pad. The nylon and Velcro removed. Chris Kraft said it plainly, years later. If that hadn't happened, they would never have reached the moon. And the mission was renamed. AS-204 became Apollo-1, the name the crew themselves had fought to use while alive, granted at the request of their widows. That's why there is no Apollo-2 and no Apollo-3. The numbering jumped to 4, counting on from a flight that never left the ground. But the fire wasn't the only thing keeping the program grounded. NASA launched a rocket with no one aboard that very nearly shook itself apart. The Saturn V flew because George Mueller made a bet. Instead of testing the rocket stage by stage, the way von Braun wanted, every stage would be live from the very first launch. It saved as much as 2 years. In November of '67 it worked. 2 months later, Apollo 5 tested the first lunar module. Its descent engine was supposed to burn for 38 seconds. It shut down after 4, and the engine was fine. Before the flight, a suspected fuel leak led to a decision to delay arming the engine, which slowed tank pressurization. Nobody told the programmers. The computer looked for thrust in the usual window, didn't find enough, and cut off. It did exactly what it was written to do. And then, on April 4, 1968, the second Saturn V started to bounce. It's called pogo. Engines never push perfectly steadily. Those tiny variations change the pressure in the fuel lines. The whole rocket vibrates lengthwise like a tuning fork, and the vibration disturbs the fuel flow right back into the engines. The cycle feeds itself. The Saturn V was designed for 1/4 G of longitudinal vibration. That day it hit 6/10. Panels tore off the adapter. NASA said it without decoration. A crew on board would have suffered severe vibration and possible injury. And that was only the first of 3 failures. In the second stage, one engine shut down when its igniter lines broke from vibration, and another, running perfectly, shut down because a wiring error sent the command to the wrong engine. Up top, the third stage refused to relight. 3 major failures in one flight, and there was no 4th uncrewed test. The problems were judged understood, and delaying the program was judged more dangerous than flying. They put helium in the oxygen lines as a shock absorber. It worked, in that stage. But the pogo didn't die. It moved into the center engine of the second stage, coming back on Apollo 8, 9, and 12. Each time it damped itself out. Each time it was declared under control. The next Saturn V carried 3 men, and it didn't stay in Earth orbit. But first, somebody had to fly the spacecraft that had killed 3 men. October '68, Wally Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walt Cunningham take the redesigned command module on its first crewed flight. 15 hours after launch, Schirra catches a cold. Sounds like nothing. It isn't. In weightlessness, mucus doesn't drain, and they couldn't blow their noses because it hurt their ears. The real problem was re-entry. With blocked Eustachian tubes, the eardrum can't equalize the pressure change. NASA's own doctors feared their eardrums might burst. That's why Schirra said they'd come down without helmets. With a helmet on, you can't pinch your nose. Mission Control pushed back, because without helmets, an accidental depressurization would kill them. Both risks were real. They came down bareheaded and without damage. They argued with the ground for 11 days, and none of the 3 ever flew again. It gets told as a collective punishment. But Schirra had already announced his retirement before the flight. The ones who paid were Eisel and Cunningham. The spacecraft, though, flew nearly flawlessly, and that opened a door. Apollo 8 was supposed to be the D mission, command module and lunar module together, in Earth orbit. But the lunar module wasn't ready, and George Low proposed something that appeared in no plan: drop the lander and send them to the moon. The missions had letters: A, the uncrewed Saturn V tests; B, the lunar module, uncrewed; C, the crewed command module; D, both together. Apollo 8 fit none of them, so they invented one, C Prime, the only mission in history to carry that designation. And the E mission was cancelled and never flew at all. December 21st, the third Saturn V ever built, the first with people inside. Within hours, Borman started vomiting. In weightlessness, vomit doesn't fall, it floats in droplets you can inhale. They recorded it on tape and told Houston afterward. On the way to the moon, Lovell keyed in a wrong instruction. The computer reset to its pre-launch program and erased the alignment of the inertial platform. Without that reference, the spacecraft doesn't know which way it's pointing. And without that, there are no precise engine burns. Lovell realigned it by hand, on the stars, through the sextant. 2 years later, he would have to do it again, under far worse conditions. The real moment came on Christmas Day. Getting into lunar orbit had a safety net, the free return. Getting out did not. One engine, no backup, lit behind the moon, out of contact with Earth. If it didn't start, they stayed. 37 minutes of silence. The engine burned for 3 minutes and 18 seconds. And Lovell's voice came back. Please be informed, there is a Santa Claus. Next came flying the lunar module with people inside. A spacecraft that cannot come home. A lunar module cannot come home. It has no heat shield, and at its thinnest points the pressure hull measured 12 thousandths of an inch, about the wall of a soda can. It wasn't as thin as kitchen foil, the way people repeat. It was 20 times thicker. But it was still a can, with 2 men inside. March 69. McDivitt and Schweikart separate from the command module for the first time in history and drift more than 100 miles away. To come back, the ascent engine had to light. One engine. No backup. But before any of that, Schweikart vomited. And vomiting inside a pressurized suit is not an anecdote. With the helmet sealed, vomit floats in the visor, can be inhaled, and can foul the valves the oxygen comes through. So the spacewalk was cut down. The original wasn't a demonstration. Schweikart was supposed to transfer along the outside to the command module, the emergency procedure, in case the docking tunnel ever failed. In the end, he only stepped onto the porch. The full transfer was never tested, and every later mission flew without knowing if it was possible. 2 months later, Apollo 10. Stafford and Cernan took Snoopy down to 47,400 feet above the Sea of Tranquility. And at staging, separating from the descent stage, a switch was in the wrong position. The backup guidance system started hunting for the command module at a moment it shouldn't have, couldn't find it where it expected, and started correcting. Cernan described it, he watched the lunar horizon go by 7 or 8 times in 10 seconds. What he shouted went out on live television, and there were complaints about the language. Stafford grabbed the controls and steadied it. Within 4 minutes, he told Houston they still had all their marbles. And then there's the myth that never dies, that they short-fueled the lander on purpose, so the crew couldn't give in to temptation and land. Cernan himself told it for years. The mission reports don't support it. The real reasons were the weight of that particular lander, landing software that wasn't finished, and a crew that hadn't trained the landing. Coming home, they hit the atmosphere at 24,816 miles per hour, still the fastest human beings have ever traveled. Artemis II came in just under it in 2026. Everything had been rehearsed. Everything except one thing: what to do if the computer started failing on the way down. July 20th, 1969. Eagle is descending toward the Sea of Tranquility. 5 minutes after the engine lights, an alarm. 12:02. The story always gets told the same way. A switch was in the wrong position. It isn't true. The checklist ordered the rendezvous radar left on, in case of an abort. Armstrong and Aldrin did what the paper said. The problem was 3 layers down. The radar and the computer ran on 2 separate 800 Hz power supplies that needed to match in frequency and in phase. The document defining the interface required the frequency. It said nothing about the phase. Nobody specified it, so nobody tested it, and no simulator reproduced something that obscure. The result? The radar bombarded the computer with data that didn't exist. 6,400 stolen cycles per second. 13% of the machine spent processing nothing, on a computer already running at 85%. Then Aldrin called up one more display. 10% more. 85 plus 13 plus 10. And here's where this breaks from the version you know. The computer didn't survive because it had power to spare. It survived because someone had assumed that one day it wouldn't. Hall Lanning at MIT had designed the operating system from scratch. Every task carried a priority, and when the machine ran out of room, it saved its state, dumped what could wait, and restarted. 5 alarms in 4 minutes. 5 restarts. The engine never stopped being steered. In Houston, Steve Bales gave the go, leaning on Jack Garman, a backroom engineer who had written himself a handmade list of every alarm code, because weeks earlier, a simulation had been aborted, wrongly, Over an alarm just like this. The same pattern as John Aaron, a kid who studied something nobody asked him to study. But they were coming down long. The docking tunnel hadn't fully vented, and the trapped air shoved them off like a champagne cork. About 4 miles past the target, with the computer steering them into the boulder field around West Crater. Armstrong took over by hand. The rule was clear. At 4% fuel remaining, land or abort. The call went out that 17 seconds were left, and that number has been repeated for half a century. Post-flight analysis showed the gauge was lying. The fuel was sloshing in the tank while Armstrong flew by hand, and the slosh corrupted the reading. They were never as close as everyone believed. But the abort decision would have been made on the false number. And then, on the ground, came the problem nobody talks about. When the tanks were vented, fuel in a heat exchanger froze and got trapped in a run of line. Heat soaking back from the just shut down engine expanded it, past the pressure where the system starts to give. They were on the moon with a line building pressure and nothing to be done. It thawed itself. Later came the ascent engine breaker, snapped off by a backpack, and Aldrin's felt-tip pen jammed into the gap. That story is true, but Houston had a backup procedure ready in case the pen wasn't enough. 9 months later, another Saturn V lifted off. It carried 3 men and an oxygen tank that had been broken for 5 years. April 11, 1970. 13:13 Houston time. 2 weeks earlier, backup crewman Charlie Duke caught German measles and exposed the crew. Lovell and Heise were immune. Ken Mattingly wasn't, and he was pulled 6 days before launch. Jack Swigert stepped in with 11 days to prepare. Mattingly never got sick, and that decision would end up handing him something far stranger than a lost flight. That comes later. 2 minutes and change into the second stage burn. The center engine shut itself down. Nobody gave that order. It was the pogo. The same phenomenon from Apollo-6, with one aggravating difference. That flight carried a lightweight mock-up. This one carried a full lunar module. With that mass aboard, the forces were of a different order. 34 G at 16 Hz, the thrust frame flexing 3 inches. 2 tons of engine bouncing 16 times a second. What saved the flight wasn't anyone. Chamber pressure fell far enough to trip a low-pressure switch, and the rocket's computer shut the engine down on its own. A few seconds more and the engine would have torn off its mounts or broken the thrust frame. Either one destroys the stage. A fix existed. The suppressor had been designed after Apollo 12, but this rocket was already stacked. Retrofitting was awkward, and the decision was made to fly one more time without it. And even so, that's not what nearly killed them. Inside the service module rode an oxygen tank that had been broken for 5 years. Link 1. In 1965, ground power was raised from 28 to 65 volts. Everything was upgraded except the safety thermostats inside the tank heaters. Nobody caught it. And the qualification tests never once checked those switches at 65 volts. Link 2. In 1968, that tank, then installed in Apollo 10's service module, jolted loose while its shelf was being lifted and struck the structure above. 2 inches. Just enough to displace a loose-fitting fill tube. The outside was inspected. The inside was not. And the shelf, tank and all, went into Apollo 13. Link 3. March 1970. The countdown demonstration test. The tank won't drain. Link 4. To empty it, 8 hours of heaters. The 28-volt thermostats took 65 volts and welded shut. Instead of cutting off at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, they let the inside climb toward 1,000. And Link 5. The technician watching saw nothing because his gauge didn't read past about 85. 8 hours like that cooked the Teflon off the fan wiring. Bare wires, immersed in liquid oxygen. April 13th. Houston asks for a routine stir of the tanks. Swigert throws the switch. At 55, 54, 53, the master alarm fires. Tank 2 loses its pressure in that instant, and the side panel of the service module blows away. And now, the line. Swigert said it first. Houston, we've had a problem here. Lovell repeated it with the detail. A main B bus undervolt. Neither of them said, Houston, we have a problem. They said it in the past tense, and it was 2 different men. The famous version was invented by a movie 25 years later. 14 minutes after the bang, Lovell looked out the window and saw oxygen streaming away from the ship, 200,000 miles from home, losing their air, and no way to turn around. The lunar module was designed for 2 men for 2 days. They were 3, with 4 to go. Aquarius could keep them alive but couldn't bring them home. no heat shield. And Odyssey, which had one, had to be shut down completely. Its batteries were all that remained for re-entry. So they powered down the good ship and took shelter in the one that couldn't return. They weren't on a free return trajectory either. They had left it the day before, to reach Fra Mauro. They lit the lunar module's descent engine, built to land on the moon, not for this, and put themselves back on free return. Rounding the moon, they lit it again to bring the arrival forward. At that point, they reached 248,655 miles from Earth. For 56 years, the farthest human beings had ever been. Artemis II passed it in 2026. To burn that engine, they had to know which way the ship was pointing. And they couldn't see stars. The cloud of debris from the explosion glittered too brightly. Houston improvised an alignment using the sun, and Lovell flew it. The second time he had aligned a platform by hand. The first was on Apollo 8, with every star in the sky and an intact spacecraft. Then, the air. The canisters that scrub carbon dioxide were square in one ship and round in the other. Two contractors who never agreed on a shape. They had plenty. None of them fit. And then something happened that has already happened twice in this video. Someone remembered an Apollo 8 simulation where a similar problem had been solved by taping plastic bags to the canisters. They asked who had done it. Joe Kerwin turned up, and within a couple of hours there was a fix. Bags, tape, cardboard from the flight plan, and a sock. It worked. The cabin fell to 38 degrees. Water was rationed to barely a glass per man per day. Heisei developed an infection with a fever and didn't report it. They barely slept. One thing remained: powering up a spacecraft that had been dead for days, in space. It had never been done. The checklist normally took 3 months to write. They wrote it in 3 days. And the man put in charge of that work was John Aaron, the same man who 4 months earlier had said 4 words nobody understood. Ken Mattingly locked himself in the simulator to sweat every switch on that list, in the exact order that wouldn't kill the batteries. The man thrown off the mission for a disease he never caught. One more problem. Heisei said the ship looked like someone had sprayed it with a hose. Days of cold had soaked the walls and the wiring bundles behind the panels. Put current through a wet spacecraft, and the expected result is a short. NASA states it plainly. There was real apprehension about short circuits, but thanks to the safeguards built into the command module after the Apollo 1 fire, no arcing occurred. That insulation existed because 3 men had died on Pad 34. Odyssey came alive. When they cut the service module loose, they saw for the first time what they had been dragging: an entire panel torn off its side. And they entered the atmosphere not knowing whether the heat shield was whole, because there was no way to check. The radio blackout ran long, almost a minute and a half long. They came out. All 3 parachutes opened. 10 months later, the program flew again. A third oxygen tank, the heaters redesigned, the wiring sealed in steel conduit. And in the second stage, installed at last, the pogo suppressor that hadn't made it in time for 13. From that flight on, the pogo vanished from the Saturn V. In command was Alan Shepard, the first American in space, grounded since 1964 by an inner ear disease that struck him with vertigo. An experimental operation gave him back his wings. He was 47. He is still the oldest man ever to walk on the moon, and the mission nearly died 3 times. The first, at docking. The probe wouldn't capture. 6 attempts across nearly 2 hours, with 13 still fresh, and no room for 2 failed missions in a row. In the end, they went in hard, shoving with the thrusters. It latched. The second, in lunar orbit. 3 hours before descent, the ground saw the abort button reading as pressed, with nobody touching it. Tapped the panel, it cleared, then came back. A loose ball of solder was floating inside the switch. If that happened during the descent, the computer would abort on its own. They called Don Iles, a 27-year-old MIT engineer who had written the descent software. In under 2 hours he had a patch, and the idea was absurd. The only way to disable the monitor was to tell the computer an abort was already in progress. 61 keystrokes, everyone perfect, because they were reaching deep into the machine's memory. It worked, at a price. Believing it was already aborting, the computer could no longer abort. If anything went truly wrong on the way down, it would have to be done by hand. The third was the landing radar, which refused to lock onto the surface. And below a certain altitude, no radar meant mandatory abort. Houston had them cycle the breaker. It locked on in time. Nobody ever determined why it failed. With all of that stacked against them, Shepard and Mitchell set down less than 100 feet from their target. the most precise landing of the program. And the next day came the cruelest part. They went on foot to find the rim of Cone Crater, hauling a cart across a sea of dunes with no landmarks. Shepard's heart rate climbed past 140, and Houston ordered them back, over both men's protests. Photo analysis later showed they were 60 to 100 feet from the rim when the order came. And there's a reason they couldn't see it. Cone's north rim is lower than its south rim. To see the crater, you had to be standing practically on top of it. They spent half an hour collecting samples 100 feet from their goal, and never knew. Apollo 15 was the first J mission, 3 days on the surface, a rover, the most ambitious flight of the program, and it went wrong 3 times. The first, on the way out. The thrust light for the main engine came on, with nobody firing it. The engine that has to work behind the moon to bring you home. The crew immediately pulled the breakers on the pilot valves, and after the flight the cause was found. A sliver of wire, barely a 1/16 of an inch long, inside the switch. The second mission in a row nearly ended by a loose scrap of metal inside a switch. From then on, every short burn was flown with half the system disconnected, just in case. The second time came after the surface. Scott and Irwin went 23 hours without sleep. The last moonwalk, the liftoff, the rendezvous, and hauling the rock boxes across. During that work, the doctors saw something on Irwin's EKG. By Gemini. 1 normal beat, 1 premature. Dr. Barry put it to Chris Kraft this way: "It's serious, if he were on Earth." And he wasn't. He was breathing pure oxygen, continuously monitored, in zero gravity. For practical purposes, something like an intensive care unit. He was not told. Neither were his crewmates. It was the first spaceflight flagged as anomalous for significant arrhythmias, with a brief loss of consciousness after his return to the command module. 21 months later, Irwin had a heart attack. NASA's doctors doubted the connection. Pre-flight testing had already shown a tendency toward arrhythmia under heavy exercise. Of the 12 men who walked on the moon, he was the first to die, and the third came in the last minute of the voyage. All 3 main parachutes deployed normally. At about 6,000 feet, one of them collapsed. They came down on 2, and landed safely, because the capsule was designed for exactly that. There are 3 parachutes because you need 2. The failed chute was never recovered. The investigation left 3 suspects, the forward heat shield passing close by, the dump of toxic propellant at that same altitude, a failed riser link, and no certainty. It was the last flight to dump that propellant during descent. April 1972. Young and Duke are already in the lunar module, undocked, suits on, descent about to begin. Ken Mattingly, alone in the command module, runs a routine check of the main engine. A little program swings the engine up, down, side to side, switches to the backup system, and repeats. A 20-second ritual. When it reached the backup, the whole spacecraft started shaking. An oscillation in the engine's secondary control system. Duke said it later, "Our hearts sank." Because that engine is what gets them out of lunar orbit, and the rules were clear. With the engine in doubt, the lander redocks, and nobody lands. Houston had 5 revolutions, about 10 hours, to find an answer before the orbit drifted past the landing site. On Revolution 15 go, the backup's oscillations weren't bad enough to cancel. They would fly on the primary system, backup disabled. Young and Duke landed 6 hours late. Mattingly stayed above, circling, alone. 8 months later, the last one flew, and Apollo 17 was nearly beaten by dust. Prepping the rover, Cernan snagged the right rear fender with the hammer in his shin pocket and tore it off. He taped it back on. Hours later, the tape gave out and the fender was gone. Without it, the wheel threw a rooster tail of dust over everything. And that is not a nuisance. Lunar dust is dark. Settle it on an instrument, and it soaks up the sun's heat until the instrument fails. A white suit coated in black dust stops reflecting and starts absorbing, with a man inside. And the grains, never worn down by wind or water, stay sharp. They work into hinges, they scratch visors. With 2 7-hour moonwalks still ahead, the rover was unusable like that. That night, Houston designed a new fender, and John Young tested it on a mock-up on Earth. The same Young who months earlier had waited in lunar orbit to hear whether he could land. Cernan and Schmidt built it out of 4 laminated lunar maps, duct tape, and 2 clamps borrowed from the ship's optical telescope. It held 4 maps, tape, and 2 borrowed clamps. That is how the program that put men on the moon ended. But there was one more flight, 3 years later. and it came closer to killing its crew than almost anything you've seen. July 1975. One command module was left over, and it was spent on a handshake. 2 ships docked, an American and a Soviet clasping hands in orbit. Aboard was Deke Slayton, one of the original Mercury 7, grounded a decade for his heart. 51 years old. First flight. The mission is remembered for the photograph. Almost nobody remembers how it ended. During descent, the switches meant to shut down the attitude thrusters weren't thrown, and the thrusters kept firing as the capsule fell. At the same time, the cabin's pressure relief valves were doing their job, drawing in outside air to equalize. They sat too close to the thrusters. What came in was nitrogen tetroxide, the oxidizer those engines burn. A gas that at first only brings coughing, and then burns its way into lung tissue and fills the lungs with fluid. It poured in for 30 seconds, from 18,550 feet down to 9,600. They splashed down, and the capsule flipped. Parachute lines caught the nose and turned it over, leaving all 3 men hanging upside down in their harnesses. Inverted, poisoned, in a cabin full of gas. Stafford told it afterward. He was holding up a little better. He knew he had toxic hypoxia and was grunt-breathing to keep his head clear. He unstrapped, crawled back over the couches to the oxygen masks, and when he looked over at Vance Brand, he saw him hanging in his straps. Unconscious. Stafford held the mask against his face until he came around. They righted the capsule, opened the vent valve, and the inrushing air carried the rest away. They walked out on their own, waved, took the president's call. 2 weeks later, they were still in an army hospital in Honolulu, on cortisone. NASA later boiled it down to one sentence. We learned not to put pressure equalization valves too close to thrusters. Learned. Afterward. That was the last emergency of the program. But one is still untold, because there was a crew that came back from the moon inside a capsule that a group of engineers quietly believed might not survive re-entry. November 1969. Apollo-12 has just reached orbit after 2 lightning strikes ran through the vehicle. The systems are back. The decision, on to the moon or home. But one thing cannot be checked. Inside the command module are pyrotechnic devices, small explosive charges whose only job is to open the parachutes at the end of the trip. The lightning had passed through there. No telemetry could say if they were still alive, and testing them meant firing them. Once, 10 days away. If they were damaged, the capsule would hit the ocean at about 300 miles per hour. The crew was not told. Alan Bean learned years later how the reasoning had gone on the ground. Bring them home now, and they die sooner than if we send them to the moon and let them come back in 10 days. And if the parachutes don't work then, at least they'll have had 10 days of a great adventure. Conrad, Gordon, and Bean went to the moon. They walked the ocean of storms. They joked on the radio. And in Houston, a group of men spent 10 days waiting to see whether 3 parachutes would open. On November 24, 1969, they opened. Not one of the emergencies you've seen was caused by a defective machine. Every one of them grew out of something nobody had gotten around to testing, and almost every one was solved the same way, by someone who had stopped to stare at something odd that nobody had asked them to look at. Jim Lovell flew to the moon twice. He never set foot on it. And he wasn't the only one. During the Apollo program, 24 men reached the moon. 12 walked on it. The other 12 made the entire journey, looked down at the surface from orbit, and turned for home. One of them, Ken Mattingly, was never even supposed to be there. Their stories are on screen now.